Are we on? There we go. Looks like we're getting all settled here. It's wonderful to see everybody again. Nice to be here this evening. No other place I'd rather be this evening than here with you all on this beautiful Michigan day. So here we are. We are officially now I'm going to call to order the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, September 18th, 2023 of the Kalamazoo City Commission. And our first order of business is roll call. Clerk Borling.
Commissioner Decker.
Present.
Commissioner Hess.
Present.
Commissioner Hoffman.
Present.
Commissioner Juarez.
Present.
Commissioner Pradel.
Present.
Vice Mayor Cooney.
Present.
Mayor Anderson.
Here. Thank you, Clerk Borling. Next on our agenda is communications. Manager Ritzma.
Nothing, Your Honor.
Thank you. Now is an opportunity for public comments, and this is the one opportunity for public comments at the Committee of the Whole meeting. We will start with people who are here in the chambers who'd like to make a comment. Just a reminder that for the Committee of the Whole, the time limit is 2 minutes. There's also another opportunity for public comment at our business meeting. So please state your name, whether you live in the city. And an additional reminder, there will be an opportunity for people to call in with public comments as well. That number is 888-382-9556. Welcome, Michelle Davis.
My name is Michelle Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Resources Incorporated, located at 420 East Alcott Street. Mayor Anderson, Vice Mayor Cooney, City Manager Ritzma, and City Commissioners, Housing Resources objects to the city's revisions to the emergency housing ordinance. In the first half of this year, 216 individuals presented for help were living on our streets, in vehicles, or places not meant for human habitation. More than half were women, and nearly all were living in the city limits. The revisions to the ordinance limiting any project to 20 emergency housing units per 365 days is unacceptable. With 40 years of expertise in providing housing solutions and acknowledging the progress of current housing development, HRI at our own expense purchased 50 Mod Pod units in 2021 to create a managed community. We have worked with city staff since 2021 with their knowledge of our plan to form a pod community, a place of dignity, with 50 units. We looked at other communities where this has worked, and we've developed a process to build such a community here. We acknowledge for the city to have guidelines, and we applaud your action to bring the ordinance forward for renewal. We've located a site, and we were preparing for a feasibility study when we learned that these revisions were placed on today's agenda. But these changes, notably the quantity of units and the phasing requirement, make it impossible to establish our pod community. We urge the city to rethink these proposed revisions. We urge the city to work with organizations like ours, to work with people with lived experience and other underrepresented groups to craft that will serve people who are unsheltered while ensuring a safe community.
Thank you very much. Hey, just a reminder, this is the Committee of the Whole meeting. We won't be taking any action on this this evening. This is really just a presentation on some proposed changes.
Good evening, Commissioners. Hi. How are you? I'm Galen Barnum from Housing Resources, and first I'd just like to thank you for continuing to recognize that the problem of homelessness is an emergency, and emergency solutions are desperately needed. And this emergency is not getting any better. I'm very concerned about the proposed revisions and the amendments to the emergency housing ordinance, especially regarding the quantity of units and the phasing proposed. This will make it impossible for HRI to continue with our PROD project, which would provide temporary living spaces to 66 adults, but also for any future creative projects that might come after us. We need to encourage new solutions that provide temporary spaces until permanent housing can be secured. We should be going faster with creative solutions and implementations to solve this emergency, not slower. The members of this current commission, the city leadership, have more people experienced in affordable housing, development, and homelessness than any other commission in recent memory, and I'm old. We can find and execute solutions together that work for everyone. People who are homeless are depending on us. I urge you to eliminate these proposed changes in this emergency ordinance and look through the lens of flexibility and urgency that homelessness requires. We believe that every heart deserves a home, and I know that you do too. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in it? Yes, please.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Karen Barnes, and I'm the Board President for Housing Resources. I have concerns regarding the housing crisis in our community and the City of Kalamazoo's role in solving for that crisis. The emergency housing ordinance needs to be extended as is, without adding restrictions on the number of units. Limitations and bureaucracy will only hinder innovation. We need as many solutions as possible to solve this problem. Luckily, we have many agencies and individuals in this community who are working on housing. It's not just HRI. We need every one of them applying their skills, experience, and ingenuity to make significant progress over the next 5 years. Communities across the country are experimenting with solutions that have never been done before, because the housing problem is at a level not seen before. Restrictions such as limiting the number of units or creating waiting periods for implementation will create unnecessary delays to getting people off the streets. Solving this problem is hard enough. HRI has made significant progress towards having a safe place for an additional 66 people to stay while they wait for permanent housing to come available. We can't afford to limit it to 20 per year and turn away so many others. As those in our community do the difficult work to house so many people in need, please don't create additional barriers. Please extend the emergency housing ordinance without amendment and help our community transition as many people as possible into permanent housing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Claudia Wink-Basie, and I'm a HRI board member. HRI applauded the City of Kalamazoo's emergency housing ordinance that was passed in December 2021 to address the need for creative solutions that offer transitional respite to the increasing number of people in our community who are living in the rough, while more long-term housing is developed. As yet, no housing providers have stepped forward to address the extreme challenge of serving the unsheltered according to this ordinance. We get it. This work is hard and it's expensive. The rigorous ordinance as written has been the template for HRI's efforts to develop a pod community that meets these standards, has economy of scale, and provides relief to potentially 66 individuals. However, as the Commission considers the renewal of the ordinance, there's a new hurdle being proposed through a phasing requirement to serve only 20 people at a site. Under the proposed formula, it would take 3 years for HRI to fully use the resource it is already invested in for this community. We know the 200+ unsheltered individuals HRI's coordinated entry system documented through just the first half of 2023 are the tip of the iceberg, as there are many unhoused people whose experience of trauma, poverty, and disability keeps them hidden. The pods proposed by HRI are new technology. There isn't any evidence-based research that sets 20 as a good size for such a community. We encourage the City Commission to trust the rigors of the original ordinance and not add language that constitutes a barrier to bringing people to safety. The unsheltered are our sons and daughters, our siblings, our cousins, former classmates, etc. How would you feel if someone was refused admission, not because HRI had no capacity, but because the barrier of 20 was established, please renew the existing emergency house.
Thank you, Claudia.
Hello, I'm Toby Hannah Davies, and I'm not from HRI, though I am wearing my HRI shirt, one of many, that says every heart deserves a home. But I am from ISAC, Housing Task Force, ISAC NTRHT, and we are very strongly in support of the HRI pod community plans. The plans include 24/7 security, 24/7 staff support. It will be a gated community, making it safe for everyone living in it and living around it. It will have support services so that people will be able to move on into permanent housing instead of the emergency housing that the pods will be. It will be so much better than the tents that people are living in, as you know, in many, many places across the community, under bridges, in woods, in wherever they can not get kicked out. Because the pods will be heated, the pods will lock, the pods will be safe for their belongings when they're not there, and safe for people when they are there. The pods will have real cots and insulation and windows. The pods will have access to community space for places to eat and places to get social services, places to have bathrooms, real bathrooms and showers. Think of what that.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the chambers who would like to comment on this, on any topic, actually? Seeing no one, Deputy City Manager Chamberlain, has anybody called in with a public comment for this evening?
All right, we'll check the lines here. We do not.
Thank you, DCM Chamberlain. I appreciate it. Manager Itzma.
Well, thank you, Mayor. We have as our topic this evening under work session, emergency temporary housing ordinance extension. And I'm going to invite forward our Deputy Community Planning Economic Development Director, Christina Anderson, and our Community Development Manager, Sherilyn Parsons. Please come forward.
Welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, City Manager, and Commissioners, City Attorney Leal. Sherilyn and I tonight are going to kind of tag team this presentation about the proposed extension of the emergency housing ordinance. Before we kind of get into the details of some changes we're proposing, I think it's important to remember where we were and what work we did in the past and how it was set up. So back in 2021, the City Commission approved an amendment to Chapter 9, specifically in buildings and building regulations, to add a specific article entitled Emergency Housing. And this allowed the development of temporary housing in the city. The ordinance outlines the standards or the parameters, loose parameters for its development. It did not select locations. It's not zoning. It did not give exact details on how it can occur, but it outlined more a set of parameters on how it might move forward. So there are a couple of pieces that are critical to moving temporary emergency housing forward. And the city bringing the ordinance to the table was part one. Housing providers are the other part of the equation. They are the implementers of the ordinance, and changes rely on these partner housing providers in order to move this forward. So under the ordinance, the way it's set up now, the housing provider would propose a location. They would come to the city to apply for permit approval. They would host the informational meeting with the community and the adjacent neighbors to provide their plans, talk about how it's going to be set up and how it will operate. The housing providers develop the housing units, and ultimately they manage the housing facility. There are kind of three buckets of things associated with the ordinance. So the first is the emergency housing facility permit and review process. Now, because this is temporary emergency housing, we had to come up with a process different than our site plan process, which is much more rigorous, takes quite some time depending on the size of the project, and requires full engineering and a variety of other details. So we had to come up with a different review process in order to move temporary emergency housing forward. So the building official and the city planner lead the acceptance of the application and the permit process for review, and that happens at a project meeting. The standards, there are standards that are roughly set up in the ordinance. Each project is meant to be reviewed as a unique proposal. Again, that's where we kind of allowed for that creativity and flexibility that we thought was needed, and we heard from our speakers at the beginning of this meeting. And so we tried to keep it as open as possible in that world. One of the third piece is the memorandum of understanding. So you apply for your permit, right, and you have to go through a review process. There's a set of standards in the ordinance that roughly need to be followed. Again, it's not site plan, it's something lighter than that. And then there's a memorandum of understanding between the housing provider, the city, and the property owner if there's a third party being involved. And staff put a lot, when this ordinance was created, staff was relying very heavily on this MOU or Memorandum of Understanding to outline how a project would be set up. It was the place where negotiations would happen for all the details that you think would be involved in a project, including discussions of staffing and number of units and how they might lay on a site. In addition to that, the MOU in the ordinance, it's very specifically lined out that the service provider cannot refuse a resident because of any characteristic: age, sex, marital status, sexual orientation, race, creed, color, gender identity, national origin, honorably discharged veteran or military status, or the presence of any sensory, mental, or physical disability, or the use of a service animal or person with disability. This is in the ordinance itself. The original ordinance lays out a sunset date and the memorandum of understanding between the housing provider and the city and the property owner that would be required to be reviewed by this body as part of that permit process, acknowledges the sunset, and at the time we had a 2-year sunset for all projects, regardless of where they started within the window of the life of the ordinance. They all had to sunset by December 1, 2023. And the MOU needs to outline how the site will be broken down and cleaned up and returned back to its original state. Management and operation of our temporary facilities need to make sure that they are in compliance with our Chapter 18 non-discrimination. And the last thing, again, I kind of noted at the top of this slide, MOUs were kind of set up to be unique negotiations per project and the needs of the project, the size of the project. And what this was kind of covering was between the project meeting, that ability to review a site, plus the MOU, we are trying to cover a lot of the bases of this, of a temporary project, since a temporary project is different than a permanent project. And we are trying to set forth ways to handle all the details between these two steps. So in 2021, some of the things that we considered when we were writing this ordinance and putting it forth for communication and ultimately approval were things like this was a 2-year opportunity to test a new housing model in Kalamazoo, one that we have not we have not experienced here. Staff did research speaking with cities who have implemented this model, as well as housing providers in other states that have used this model to get some lessons learned and to have some additional information for shaping the ordinance. 2021 and today, this is a response to a crisis. That has not changed. In 2021, we understood that this new housing model would have a lot of unknowns with it. And so we were trying to put forth a set of rules in the ordinance and parameters to help guide the development while keeping the fact that there were a lot of things that we weren't going to know until they happened, and how to figure out and try to set us up to be in the best position to deal with those when they happened. And these include community reactions. Finally, staff considerations in 2021, that heavy reliance on the MOU to establish the site parameters and mitigate any potential issues between moving forward with a temporary project versus a permanent project, and the development issues that might come forward with one versus the other in that 2-year model.
So in 2023, we actually considered the same things that Christina just went over, but then some additional ones based on kind of the lessons learned. Even though we didn't have any of these come forward, we did have people question about them, attempt to bring forth a concept. And so under the first one, the 2-year opportunity to test the new model, that was the first feedback that we heard. No projects came forward, so we don't have any lessons learned. All we can address now is what we've heard, the comments, and some of the challenges that were brought up. So one of the first things that was brought up is that the 2-year sunset really probably should be extended, that there is a cost to doing these shelters, and to have them have to pay for the cost and potentially erect them for 1 year and then take them down and clean up, that the cost to do that could just make it to where people could not do that. So the first request was, can you extend that out later? Can you extend the sunset date out? So on the proposed change, we did extend that out, so it's a 5-year, and the way that it would work is it's basically 5-year plus an additional winter. So it extends out till 2029. In testing this new model, we did, when we had people come forward with concepts, we were seeing there was sort of a blurring between what's temporary shelters and what in our world is more of a permanent development or a semi-permanent development. So we also wanted to not create something that had a slant to permanent development requirements when this was a temporary housing ordinance. The second thing that 2021 and 2023, as Christina mentioned, is this was a response to a crisis. When we as staff talked about this, we said that crisis is still here. That still remains. We need to do something to extend this ordinance that is about to sunset. And so that's what has us here today. As mentioned with the new housing model with many unknowns, including community reactions. So one of the things we thought about with extending the ordinance to longer than 2 years, or for some people, depending on when they got in, just 1 year, is we need to know in a longer term development, all right, what have we found out about emergency responses? And within those responses throughout each season, because summer carries a unique set of challenges different from those of winter. And so to be able to see how does the site and the shelters and the housing provider, how is this temporary development or project carry through all 4 seasons. We also, because we didn't have any pilots come through on this, there are still unknowns about this. What's kind of the tipping point with unknown project population needs? What's the right staffing? What's staff up? I heard someone say, 24/7, for one unit, that might not be necessary. For multiple units, maybe that's necessary. But without any lessons learned, kind of give a chance to feel what's the right size for this, as well as what's the right size for community reactions and community concerns. So we did hear concerns about sizing when initially there was some, I'm going to say maybe misinformation given about specifically HRI's pod project, and there were just concerns that were given about, in my opinion, kind of misinformation that was put out there, cart before the horse. But so there were concerns that we heard and were considerate of. And then to just think about the impact. All right, in thinking through having a pilot or a test ordinance here, what's the impact, worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario, and how can we establish a baseline to be able to answer those when we've never tested the model? And so we were really considering what is a safe way to establish a baseline. And then I'm just going to pop back one more time because I also heard in the comments something about a 3-year ramp up, and on the slide, 2 slides from now, we initially indicated that we thought maybe a 3-year ramp up was the right timing, but we got feedback on that, and you'll see in the diagram that we reduced that from a 3-year to a 1.5 year ramp up. So just want to put that in there. And then also in 2021, there was a heavy reliance on the MOU, establishing the site parameters. We still considered that in the 2023. So the MOU is the opportunity for there to be unique negotiations on the expectations without many set parameters. So we are trusting that the housing providers or those that want to participate in the ordinance, that they are an expert in what they're presenting. And so we are still leaning heavily on the MOU and the information that they're providing, and trusting that they know some statistics better than we do. That an MOU has that has a higher focus on programming and services. So if, as mentioned, if 24/7 is needed, then that's written in the MOU. If 24/7 is not needed until, then that's written in the MOU. So that's what we were sort of thinking about in the phase, which the 2 major changes of this ordinance from 2021 are the sunset time going from a 2-year to a 5-year and the phasing approach. And the MOU is a pledge by all parties to make the site work for a short period. And so that is still in works and still a heavy consideration. But then we thought about the longer time period. So longer time periods, we thought, really do have a greater impact on the site and the adjacent area. So let alone just the project itself, but when there's a permanent development, the site itself goes through a lot of the words escape, a lot of critical eyes on it. There's environmentals, there's phase 1, phase 2s, there's how does drainage respond to this, how does sewage respond to this, how does water respond to this, how does fire safety, how about the weights that are on it. So there's a lot for permanent development that is factored in on the site itself. But in the temporary ordinance, those factors are not really looked at with a critical eye. So we wanted to see, there needs to be a place where we see the impacts on the site itself. So in shifting from a long-term or short-term to a longer time period, the conversations that staff were having is, all right, if we go to a longer time period, there should either be a more thorough review of the facility plan, similar to what we would do in site plan. and require more permanent site changes, or maybe there's a different way, and could that be an incremental implementation based on site conditions over multiple seasons and taking into consideration the experience of the housing provider on that site during the time. And so that's where we extended the sunset date to April 30th, 2029. And we also thought about, for larger projects, what would it look like during that longer time frame if it was phased into existence versus just all of them at once, so that we could test the site and we could have a full season to review that everything was operating in the way that everyone hoped it would. So the initial development would allow 20 shelters. The MOU would also outline the phases, and it would include that staffing and facilities, faculty support, facility faculty supports. And then each phase installation would come with inspections from city, so that there would be some built-in city capacity and oversight into ensuring that everything within the MOU and on the site were behaving in the way that all agreed to. So this is the little diagram that I just spoke about a few minutes ago. Initially, we thought we would do 20 in 1 year, 20 in 1 year, and 20 in 1 year. So there would be 2 inspections required until you could do additional phasing. And it could go on 20, however many your site would allow. So we didn't put a cap on how many shelters would be allowed. And we did receive immediate feedback on that regarding just the challenges that long of approach would take. And so in this new proposal, we scaled that back to where the first 20 would still undergo a one-year time frame, so that once again, all 4 seasons, all of the changes that take place within a year of operation would be noted. 6-month inspection, pass, 6-month inspection, pass. After the initial 12 months, there would be an additional 6-month period. Okay, so sorry, after the first 12 months, I'm going to talk to Mayor here because I see what is she saying? 12 months, you pass, immediately you can go into your second phase, which would be 20 more units. After 6 months, you could go into your next phase, which would be 20 more units. So if you were doing 60 units, you would onboard those within a year and a half. If you were doing 80 units, you would onboard those in 2 years, barring that each 60 or 6-month inspection passed through with no complications. So these considerations were in response to the following comments or concerns that we have heard. There was a concern of having too many shelters erected at one time. There was concern with concentrated temporary residences or residents. There was a desire for a time period greater than 2 years. There was a desire for no sunset on the temporary housing ordinance at all. There was a desire to erect an unlimited number of units on a site all at once. There was concerns that permanent development supporting the same population does not require phasing, so why would temporary? And so I think we addressed that in this as well, but we're open for questions after this. There was a concern if a housing provider desires a project larger than 20 shelters and phasing is required by the ordinance, the site's development would be too costly. So that is a concern that we couldn't directly answer, as we didn't have any baseline to know about the direct costs, but that was brought up as a concern. So at this time, we're going to open up to questions, discussions.
Thank you, Sherilyn. I appreciate that very much. Questions, commissioners?
I'll go.
Commissioner Hess.
Just, can you clarify, is HRI the only entity that has come forward so far with our emergency housing ordinance? And if not, who are the others that have shown interest?
So right now, HRI is the organization that I am primarily talking to, that has a concept that they're ready to take to the next step. We did have other concepts presented over the 2 years, but none that took it to the next step of, like was mentioned, securing a site and starting to work on a model and a development and the plan and really mapping it out. So we did have other concepts, but HRI is the organization that is interested in actually moving forward with their concept at this point.
Thank you. And I don't know if they would answer this, but and you would know, where are they in the process? I mean, is it going to happen? I think that's the question of a lot of people in town is, is it really going to happen?
Yeah, so I hate to speak for them, but from my perspective, I think that, the main challenge was site control, and they're there. They have that. As mentioned in some of the comments, they are working through their plan. As their board members came up and spoke, their board is aware. The board has given permission to move forward. So I do not see any red flags as to why it would not happen.
Thank you, Commissioner Hess. Commissioner Hoffman?
Thank you all. So I must say, I was shocked and disappointed when I saw this was going to be the presentation for Cal. It made me question, one, does the city really want to do anything about our unhoused population? We have not invested nearly enough in our unhoused population. And I want to know from us on the dais, how committed and invested are we and really making sure that we do not put additional barriers on an ordinance when we are still coming out of a pandemic and our unhoused population is growing exponentially every single day. I wonder, Sherilyn, why is 20 the magic number?
Yeah, so I wasn't at the 2021 table, but I was told that in talking to other communities, 20 was the magic number, that other communities were saying that between 12 and 20 is kind of a magic number as far as what their allowances were per site. And so that was the number that was discussed around the table as a reaction to what other communities are doing.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that some of my fellow commissioners have spoken publicly about a project that hasn't even been presented yet. And what was being said was that they did not outright deny or say we're not for this project, but you talked about barriers such as environmental, such as concentrated poverty. What we understand is we have a viable solution right here that's been presented by HRI. And if we know as a community, the entire community knows, people outside of Kalamazoo knows, there are 50 housing units available right now that have been in storage for over a year now, and yet we still want to hold on to this magic number, 20. I want to say this, Kalamazoo has always been a leader in the state regarding creativity, boldness, and innovation, specifically when it comes to the quality of life for our residents. We've always taken the lead on that. We have the Kalamazoo Promise, first to do that. We have a Homes for All millage. We were the first one in the state of Michigan to pass a millage for families that were suffering from housing insecurity in 2015. Why won't we take the boldness that we have? We have people sleeping on the grounds We have people, we hear about the defecation going on downtown. We have a solution right here. I don't understand why we would put more barriers in this ordinance when we are still, it's not an emergency to us. If we have all these barriers, it's not an emergency, but yet we know it's an emergency. So why couldn't we just extend it as is and let the organization that's doing the work, that has been doing the work, who has proven their ability to be developers of affordable housing, why don't we trust them knowing that we have 50? Why can't we make that number instead of 20? Why can't we make that number 50?
So I think there are a couple things that staff was considering. Again, this is new for the city. We are not taking it through our site plan process where we vet every detail of a project and then are confident in not having utility issues or sewer backups or any other thing that's reviewed in site plan. When we started to talk about extending it beyond the 2-year period, it started to blur with something that felt more permanent. And to take it through with the same level of review and scrutiny as something that was 2 years or less did not feel comfortable to staff. And so by expanding it to 5 years, we felt that we needed to think through a few more details through the project, and that's where we started our conversation today.
So this project that HRI is proposing, it is very new for Kalamazoo, but Kalamazoo is an innovator. So I'm still not understanding why 20, when we have a product in place, and I'll tell you what will happen. 20 will go up. HRI, I guarantee you they'll get phone calls. Why aren't the other 30 up? Who's going to have to cover that storage cost? HRI. And other communities that have done this, the city made a commitment and county made a commitment, and they allocated ARPA dollars to do a project. But we haven't stepped up in that matter yet, and that's not to you all, that's to us up here. So my question is, I'm going to tell you I don't have another question. I want to say, I've learned a lot of lessons since 2018 in going through this process. I learned that we talk about love, but we don't always act in love as a commission. We like the fluffy stuff, but the hard work of serving our unhoused population, that is hard work, and we have to do better. So that's one lesson I learned. I learned that people will talk and say yes in your face, and behind your back do something else. Another lesson learned. So lessons have always been, I've been learning them a lot. I want to say this, and then I'm going to leave it alone for now. I could support this if this revision can have 50 units. We can erect 50 units, and we do a phased approach with the residents moving in. So it makes no sense for us to have product in storage, and we phase in 2020. We have 50 units, and we phase the people that will be living in that community in. That is what I would like to see happen.
Thank you, Commissioner Hoffman. Other Commissioner questions?
May I respond to something?
Oh, I'm sorry, sure.
Hoffman just said. Yeah, so we did, I believe the ordinance through the MOU would allow the phase-in of the population. So the phase-in could be the erection of the shelters or the phase-in of the residents. So that would come through the MOU, and that actually was one of the things that was brought forward regarding the cost. So it's a cost to erect some units and then stop, vacate everyone so you can erect the next set of units, stop, vacate everyone. So we did address that the MOU would allow a phasing in of the residents, and then there would be inspections to ensure that the other units were vacant. So I believe we did discuss that through our MOU process.
Is it possible that that can be made more explicit So there's no confusion and an individual or organization comes and then it's like, oh, so is there any way we can get language in there that makes it that explicit?
Yes, we can take any of the changes that we hear tonight and put them and continue to discuss them and put forth an updated copy. I think that when we, depending on how an organization may move forward, so if all the pods or all of the shelters were put on a site at once, I think the MOU would have to discuss how those are kept secure and, how they're maintained and checked in the vacant state. Would there be additional facilities built on the site? There's probably a different number of bathrooms when there are 20 versus 50 or 60, and would those all be on the site at once, and how would those be secured or maintained? So I think there would need to be some details that we need to talk through and put in the MOU versus if you did 20 shelters with the bathroom and community facilities, those go down. Then you do the next with the next bathroom facilities. I think that, they just have they're going to need some different parameters in the MOU for how you move forward on that site.
Thank you. And then one last thing, I just want to say, this is a midterm, long-term solution to our housing crisis. It's going to take developers at least 2 to 6 years to get affordable housing erected and ready, right? And so we have to do something as a city to ensure that those that are sleeping in the woods, on the streets, nowhere, no safety, that we provide something that is creative, that will give and serve people and give dignity and respect to them as they're transitioning through this life cycle. So I will beat you all up for this one if we can't get this done.
Thank you, Commissioner Hoffman. Other questions or comments?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner
I
Williams.
think, in my time spending, working at Urban Alliance and working with the homeless population ever since it was in Bronson Park, and what we see take place in those situations was it was uncontrollable. The crime rate went up. Sexual assault, stabbings, drug use, overdoses skyrocketed in those encampments. Now, I'm not saying that's gonna happen in these pods, but what I am saying, when you put 50 people in a concentrated area all at once, and you don't have any kind of learning, redoing, redeveloping, and then doing it again, there's none. So for us to say that 50 going up in one spot is the ideal thing, we don't have evidence that shows that that is even doable. Not to say that the city's not saying we should do something about homeless population and this housing thing. Of course we are. That's why we created this ordinance. But it does cause a little disappointment in me that those pods were sitting in a warehouse for a whole year. If we're talking about emergency, then those things should have been moved and figured out, and bringing more people to the table. Now, when you talk about supportive services and wraparound services, is HRI the only organization doing that? Because if that's the case, I'm concerned. It's not enough people working on it at the same time. And we see that in gun violence. We have 12 groups working on gun violence right now, but we need more. So when you talk about supportive services and wraparound services for individuals who are coming out of living in encampments and thinking that they're going to abide by the rules right off the bat because you provided a pod for them, I think they would be thankful. But you're talking about mindsets that have been conditioned for years. You're not talking about us fighting against pods going up. We're talking about us figuring out how to do it in a way that actually serves the people that we're serving with dignity, the right way, and not just throwing them up because we have space to throw them up. I think that's my biggest thing, because when I was going down to the encampment every Monday, when I was at Urban Alliance feeding these individuals, the things we witnessed multiple organizations, people coming and dropping off donations and doing it because they felt like they were led to, but there was no one to organize around it, and it became a dump. It became a cesspool. Fires started to happen. Tanks, those propane tanks blew up and blew people's stuff up. So, the police department, and then you're talking about, like, how do you keep 50 pods safe? Not just from yourself, but from other people, right? The drugs, like, man, I'm telling the stories that I witnessed with these individuals being gathered in one place was very concerning. Not to say that we're not looking to stop these pods going up, but we should really consider, if we don't have any evidence-based practices in the last 2 years here in Kalamazoo, then why would we just go in and do something and throw it up? That makes no sense to me. And so being considerate about how you do this in phases and in the process is probably a better idea. It seems to me, in my opinion, not to say that that's the way, but working with homeless population firsthand, I've seen some things. So I just like to say that because it's not us saying we're gonna stop this process. It's us saying, how do we do it with excellence? It seems to me.
Thank you, Commissioner Juarez. Commissioner Prado?
Sure. There was something, I think it was Claudia, that got up and spoke that kind of resonated with me a little bit, that caused me some concerns and resonated. It was, I think the quote is that, as written, the previous ordinance draft, or approved ordinance, temporary ordinance, has been a template for HRI that they followed to make plans. And I think, when you see the fact that they're the only one that's come forward with the viable planning process to do this, it's kind of like, okay, it's been 2 years, and I've been following this plan that you gave us to do, even with all the barriers to do it, and now 2 years later, it's like, okay, there's still nobody coming forward, there's still no other plan, and then when we feel like we're maybe getting close to being at a point where something might happen, now it's like, we're gonna change it and add more barriers. To me, the evidence of the last 2 years is kind of an explanation to say that this process is really, really hard, and it takes somebody super, super special to do this work. And now 2 years in to come in and kind of like rewrite the way to make that happen seems to me unfair. And I think, I think that's something to think about, because it is hard being a nonprofit and, think that you're doing everything right to try to do it to an already kind of like barrier hard process. And then that late in the game, when you're already like struggling, you've been paying to keep these pods in storage, then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, I think we're gonna make it a little harder, And I understand the concern about, that these things are untested, but I almost wonder, is there a way to do the 50 and then let the incremental growth beyond 50 be the test? Just something to think about. I have a couple other questions, but just wanted to get your initial thoughts on that.
Sure. I think that the change that we're talking here about is 2 years to 5 years. And so that starts to make us think a little bit differently about how we set ourselves up for success in these projects. And that was the impetus for thinking through some of the details differently. So again, 2 years, short, there are things that, it's that blur between temporary and starting to get permanent. And again, that's the change, and that's what triggered, well, we might need to think about this a little bit differently. If we're talking about 5 years plus, right? So it's 5 years plus another winter.
And I definitely hear that, and I appreciate how thoughtful you guys are always about thinking these things through. The only thing is, again, realistically, this issue, I hope I'm wrong, but this is an issue that's plagued communities for as long as communities have existed. And the realistic nature is that, we're probably still going to be incrementally trying to figure out how to house people, 5 years out. And so, this isn't, whether we're talking about 2 years or 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, I hope that we've got a real wrap on this issue, but there are always going to be people in transition that we're going to need to figure out how to help. And so, you know, I mean, that's, yeah, I don't know if you have any more thoughts about that, but.
Just the last thing I was going to say is, you know, staff is always tasked with that balance, right? Balancing community opinion, our partners' thoughts and desires, how we work within our own set of rules and ordinances, and we're always tasked with trying to meet that balance.
Sure.
And again, by tweaking one aspect of the ordinance, it shifted something else for us.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, what we've put forth and what we can continue to talk through, right? This is why we're here tonight, is to discuss these details and then come back and think about how it can be adjusted or how we can make some changes. What we wanted to present to you tonight was, we know we need to extend the ordinance. If we know that there's a desire to increase the length of time that this ordinance is in place because of a lot of the reasons we've discussed tonight. Okay, so the kind of impact or ramification on that for staff felt like we also needed to make some changes in terms of being comfortable with the blur between something that's very short term versus more semi-permanent to permanent. And so that's really just, you know, to detail why we came forward with that. It wasn't any attempt to pull the rug out from anybody.
Mm-hmm.
It was, if we're thinking through how we're going to make the changes, you know, that's where we got. If we perhaps thought of something that was just another 2-year extension, you know, maybe that's a different set of parameters that are in here or not. But then with 2 years, then you're back to that initial problem is 2 years enough?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we're here trying to balance everything and come forward with, you know, at least the best starting point that we can for discussion.
I remember when we were having this conversation 2 years ago as well, one of the biggest issues of contention was the concentrated poverty, you know, that all of a sudden the concentration of poverty balloons in one place or a site or whatnot. And I know that there were some conversations about, you know, potentially looking at clusters, and I'm not privy of like what the sites or where the planning is to know, you know, where they would be and whatnot. And, you know, you might not be able to share, and you might not know, but do you know if there's any conversations about clusters versus just one, you know, omnibus site? And the reason I ask about that is because I wonder if that could potentially impact the planning and how this ordinance could impact those sites. Because I'm curious, is the limitation of a phased approach for 20 units for each incremental inspection, is that based on one service provider, or is that considered for one site? Does that make sense?
Sure. So we do not have an application in front of us. We do not have a set of plans, so cannot answer questions on how the site is laid out and whether it's laid out in small clusters or larger. Those would be questions for the service provider, for the housing provider. Mm-hmm. It's meant to be the way the ordinance is written. It's the site. Now, you could have multiple housing providers on a site, right, that are working together, but we're talking about site and site capacity. Right, even, you know, if there were multiple housing providers, the utilities are still the same. The impact on adjacent neighbors, regardless of how many providers there are, is the same, right? I mean, that would be true for any project. So, you know, if you had one person own 5 commercial businesses on a site, or five different people owning 5 commercial businesses on the site, the impact to the adjacent and to, you know, the surrounding area is the same. So we think about it as a site.
Mm. I think one of the challenges that we're going to face as a community is that we're already a pretty landlocked community, right? I mean, we're an urban core community that is 54% non-taxable, and, you know, that there's very limited forests left, and, you know, and there are a number of brownfield sites and whatnot. And so I think, you know, that thoughtfulness in terms of like recognizing us as a community as well, that, you know, we, in some ways, just our community itself can be a barrier. And again, you know, that's just my concern about, you know, creating more barriers at this point in the game. It just kind of feels a little bit about, reminds me of that commercial where there's like an insurance commercial where he's holding up the fishing pole and you know, like, you know, a little bit further kind of thing. And that's hard when you're a nonprofit service provider, right? And so, I don't know, it's just 2 cents on that. So thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Prado. Commissioner Decker.
Thank you, Mayor. just kind of listening to my team up here, and I guess I have a question. You know, when you guys were talking about, you know, changing the things and putting the phasing into this, have we had a conversation with the one and only organization, HRI, about how would this set them back? What kind of extra cost would they incur? If you could talk a little bit about that, you know, have we had those conversations to know that putting this information now into the ordinance, is it gonna cost them to another $1 million, or is it gonna set their project back another 6 months to a year?
Yes, we did have a conversation when we asked for comments regarding the proposed change. Now, just keep in mind, we are asking to extend the temporary emerging housing ordinance for anybody who wants to do it. So it wasn't actually written for one project. It was for anyone who wants to do this. But we did request comments and feedback. As mentioned, the original consideration was to phase a project in annually. And HRI had great concerns with that because it took a project from being done in what they hoped would be, you know, within 3 to 6 months, to 3 years. And so there was conversations about where could a compromise be. And I know it was mentioned, you know, just passing the ordinance as is, which we could have just created a new 2-year sunset date, but it was HRI who requested a longer date. That the 2 years it's not feasible to pay the amount of cost for infrastructure and facilities and the pods. And we agreed for 2 years, or let's say it takes 6 months to get erected, for 1.5 years. And so we did start to think about, okay, how do we extend this ordinance out for 5 years? But keep in mind, it's for anybody. So if anybody comes up, this ordinance allows this to happen for anybody who wants to do it. And so thinking about, as Christina mentioned, thinking about, all right, extending this out for the longest amount of time that we really can as a temporary ordinance, that would be 5 years, and still allow for there to be some economical sense for the provider who's doing this. If we do that, you know, if we pull it over here, what's the lever over here that has to go with it? And that's when the phasing came. So there were discussions about reducing that, trying to figure out a way to reduce that 3 years. So we did reduce it from the 3 years to the 1.5 years. And that is where the sort of the first phase of this came in. Thank you, Christina. So that's where that year is still the largest delay of the process. But that's where it was thought, like, let's get that baseline in that year and then accelerate the project. And so that was the conversation and the compromise that was had. And then Commissioner Hoffman did ask about, which we did talk about in the meeting as well, of, okay, well, if we only erect 20 and then we have to disturb everything to erect another 20, what does that look like? So we did talk about that particular issue would be addressed through the MOU.
Okay, thank you. I do have to say that when you think about the costs and what an organization, a nonprofit, or a service provider is going to spend to help get these erected, you think about when you only put up 20. So you have an organization, you know, when they're doing their site plans and figuring out things, you know, if you only put up 20 and say they're planning for getting their documents ready to say, we're planning for 50, we need this many bathrooms, or we need this many showers, or we need this much space for a cooking facility. And I think it kind of
it might not put them at ease, because it could be where, okay, we've got 20 pods that are up, and now we've done these inspections and we're still working through things, but, you know, when we want to put up the next 20, did we build enough bathrooms for that? Did we build enough showers for that? Do we have enough space? So I think that is, you know, something that I'm kind of thinking about too. When you talk about the money, again, right now we're talking, I guess, primarily regarding HRI, because they are the ones, excuse me, that have the pods. But I think that being able to erect all of the pods at once, and as Commissioner Hoffman had said also, was having the phased occupancy of those. And again, within the MOU, we can discuss what that phase could be. I definitely don't think it should be a year if we've got 200 plus individuals that are, you know, within our streets that are houseless. And I do think that, you know, kind of what Commissioner Pradel says, this is another barrier. I know I had asked, you know, what are the barriers that's making this so long, you know, to get done? And I do feel that this is just adding something else to that for what they've worked so hard for, this particular organization, in so many years. And Commissioner Juarez, you talked about, you know, the drug infestation and whatnot. This can be for anyone that is houseless. It doesn't have to, you know, I don't want us to put everyone in the same boat. This could be a single mother who is leaving a shelter that, you know, has stayed there too long, cannot find another place, that needs somewhere to go, that is not drug infested, or does not use drugs, or is not something like that. So I don't want us to get that thought that it's everyone out there that is houseless uses, you know, drugs. It's not. It can be someone that is getting evicted from their home and needs a place to go for a certain time. You think about the Housing First model, you know, especially people that are houseless, Housing First model, if you give someone a home, then they're able to kind of get their life on a track. They have somewhere to go, they have somewhere to shower, they have somewhere to eat. And it gives them just a little bit more pride, you know. And I don't think that within the MOU that individuals are going to be staying there. I know it said something on here for the time frame within the MOU of how long they would be there. I don't think anyone's going to want to be there for a very long time, because, you know, they are going to want to get their own permanent housing. And as Commissioner Hoffman also said, it's going to take about 2 to 6 years to get some housing built that is affordable, that individuals can be in. I'm wondering, within the MOU or within this ordinance, when you talk about, you know, not having enough staff there to, you know, regulate and to kind of keep an eye on everything, what if, once you say you get all 50 up, what if you have the move-in occupancy of the 20, and then 3 or 6 months you have your inspection, and then everything is going great, and then we want to open it up to the rest of the pods being occupied? Maybe would we be able to bring in another service provider that could offer assistance to them? So you would have 2 working together versus just the one. And again, putting it as, you know, Commissioner Juarez said, you know, that's a lot of things to do with just one service provider. What do you think about that?
Sure. So I think we need to take a little bit of a step back for the ordinance. The service provider, the housing provider, can work with whatever other housing providers they need to make sure they have the right capacity on the site to meet the needs of their residents. And that is different than, the ordinance, right? The MOU is not going to say that thou shall have multiple housing providers partner here. It's going to talk about the number of the population and the amount of staff, and talk about the security. Is it going to be 24-hour? You know, those kind of details. The concerns on staff's part and why we're suggesting these changes is less to do with that element, because the housing provider is going to be the expert on that. Our concern has to do with the site itself. Typically, when we run a permanent project, goes through a very long, detailed process to make sure that there's all the environmentals are fine. I know we keep saying this, but this is what we do in site plan, is to kind of make sure that the site is going to operate effectively, and that's appropriate for a permanent development. What we're talking about here is not that. So we've dialed that back to understand what we would need to look at, who would need to be at the table to make sure that we're creating a safe environment. If we're talking about a longer period of time, staff was more comfortable with going through that review process as we set up initially, but then letting it get through some seasons, right? How is the site going to operate in the winter when it's wet versus in the summer? How does that impact mobility around the site? There were some things that how are the structures themselves going to hold up through all of these seasons as temporary structures? And that is not necessarily a comment on the pods that we are more familiar with, but again, this is meant to be for anyone who comes forward with this type of project and potentially a different product. So we're talking about the ability of the site physically to handle this type of development with the type of review that we're doing and increase the population, less so than the ability to have multiple housing providers. Now, at the inspection point, at each of the inspection points, that's an opportunity for the housing provider to say, yeah, we've been having, this issue or that issue, we do need to ramp up staff, right? Especially if we're going to increase the number of people that we have on site. And that's something that they can do. If it is impacting the ability of the site to function from a building or utility or life safety function, then, that's going to be an issue with the inspection. But if we're talking about wraparound services and those type of details, that is housing provider managed, not necessarily city managed. So again, when we're talking about phasing, we are thinking as development staff and thinking about the site.
Thank you. I don't really have a problem with the phasing. I think it's more of the timeline of the phasing of how long it's going to go. I know we want to talk about the seasons, but individuals have been living in the seasons year in and year out. Winter, summer, fall, spring. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm all.
Thank you, Commissioner Decker. Vice Mayor Cooney.
Thank you, Mayor. So every one of us up here realizes the depth of this problem, and Commissioner Hoffman has laid it out so well. So this is dragged on for too long. We're talking emergency here. And we're saying emergency. We're trying to say, oh, we got to keep this safer. They're not safe out there now. A wise man said one time, the best is the enemy of the good. This is good. The best would be, the issues that you're laying out are real. All those things really did happen, and happen in more than one site. And the best would be if we could have pods of 10 or 20 and we had full services. We don't have the money. Nobody's stepping forward with the resources to do that. What we do have is a group of people here who have decades of experience, who care about all these safety and all these other things that we've been talking about here, as much as we care, if not much more. They recognize all those problems. If there was a group of people here who come in from the street and said, we're going to do this, we would say, whoa. But this is a group of people who have decades of experience. We know that this has happened in other places around the country, and they've worked it out. I think the question that we should be asking is, how can we help you make this happen? Because we have to do this. We can't put this off. We can't limit how many people are going to do here. If they make mistakes, we want to correct them. But the people aren't safe out there now, and the emergency continues. We have a group of people who have come up with a plan, who know what they're doing. We ought to make that happen.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. All right, so second chance here. All right,
Okay, so,
Commissioner Hess.
thank you, Vice Mayor. And so this is in effect until April 30th, 2029. At that point, unless the ordinance is continued, do the pods come down?
Correct. So it would be the same language as is in there now. There is a sunset. The sunset would be, instead of December 1, 2023 for clearing the site, it would be, if no other action is taken, it would be April 30th, 2029.
Okay. And if it turns out to be successful, we can always amend this ordinance.
Then we have the opportunity to amend the ordinance and take the lessons learned from it to, potentially reshape it or think about how we make this type of housing replicate it in other places.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hess. Commissioner Juarez.
What was the issue behind securing the land or the plot of property to put these pods on? What was the biggest problem?
So that would be a question that would be better for HRI because, again, the way the ordinance is set up, the city is not the land, we're out of that detail, right? It is the housing provider coming forward to the city with their site and having discussions with us. I would imagine that just like any project, we are a built-out community. There are very few properties that exist that might be for sale, that of a certain size, that would present challenges for someone to find the right site that meets their criteria. But as for the details, that would be a housing provider, in this case, HRI question.
Okay. So I think, Don Cooney, you're correct. We need to support this, right? I do believe that. I think nobody up here is saying don't do this. But we don't want to just throw caution to the wind, right? So at the same time, does the city own property that HRI could use?
So most of the city's property is brownfield property, which is contaminated property. So really is not conducive to a longer-term temporary housing structure. So it's not really something that city staff was comfortable to say, I think a contaminated site is a good site for this development.
So just at this point, specific to the ordinance that we have in front of us and the proposed changes, any other questions or comments? I think we've fairly much expressed those. So at this point, if it's okay, I've got a few questions, so I'll go ask those as well. So anyway, thank you for bringing this forward. Obviously, it was going to run out, so it's time to look at it again and bring it forward. So I appreciate that the team is taking time to do that. I had a few questions, just wondering, not specifically on just a couple changes that we've are thinking about, but just looking at the ordinance in its entirety, just to make sure we've thought about those things. So here's one of them. I know that was a bit of a surprise for everybody, but there were concerns expressed by the director of the County Public Health Department, Jim Rutherford, some months ago. Is that recognized in any way in this, or do we feel like that should not be in this ordinance, any recognition of any approval along those lines?
Direct changes were not made to the draft that you have in front of you based on those comments. We worked internally with our building official, as well as other staff, to review the ordinance to understand if we were comfortable with where we are right now. This ordinance is here for discussion, so if there are additional things that need to be reviewed, right now is the time for those discussions. But at this point, what is forward has been reviewed by city staff and are at a place where they're comfortable.
Okay. So, we list in this ordinance, the criteria that we'll be evaluating in application, and presumably some indication about what the ongoing inspection criteria will look like. In another area that we regulate, like rental housing, for example, there's an extended set of guidelines so that it is clear for the manager of the property as well as the inspector what's inspected, what are the recourses, what are considered emergencies, how you must respond to those emergencies, what is considered a non-emergency, out of compliance, time frames related to all that. I mean, just an extended, section. And part of what that does is avoids, not that you want to create a whole effort around that, but it avoids misunderstandings or a difference of interpretation about expectations. So, not that I want to put a lot of detail into that, but evidently you're not proposing anything. So we must feel that we're comfortable that we have a sufficiently clear set of standards for the inspections and opportunities to address out of compliance issues, that this seems, we feel like what we have is good enough to address those kind of concerns or eventualities.
Yes, the building official at the time of drafting this felt comfortable, as did myself as city planner. However, it's very easy to come up with a checklist that we could create so we're clear and something that we repeat each time. We did think about rental registration through this process. That's one of the reasons why we adjusted, helped us think through how we could adjust the phasing and what that looks like. The building official regularly does inspections of small structures, right? And so thinking about utilities, and does it have the required, I wasn't gonna say ventilation, I'm trying to remember the smoke.
Air quality?
No, the little red thing that you keep in your kitchen.
Oh, fire extinguisher, yeah.
That's it. The building official has a list of things that they are reviewing, right? And so for those type of details, we are very comfortable. I don't think it is a poor idea to think about the site itself and what would be some of the check boxes that we'd want to review compared to the original, the plan submitted and the MOU. Again, these inspections were building official life safety details and a comparison to the plans submitted. Right? Are all the paths in? Are they still, free of obstacles? Can people move around the site? Are there the right number of bathrooms for residents? And those are all fairly standard things. That doesn't mean that we couldn't create some sort of document for review just so everyone is on the same page.
Okay, I appreciate that. So I presume that there won't be an issue related to the operation here, that this in essence is going to be operated what I will describe as shelter rules rather than landlord-tenant rules, which is a whole different approach to managing something. I just wonder if there's going to be contemplation of that and making sure there is, very clear, expectations around that. So, just for the assistance of the site manager, whoever that may be, if it is interpreted at some level, I don't know where that might be, legal aid, who knows where, that this is something where landlord-tenant rules are involved, then that's going to make it very, very difficult for the manager to address some immediate situation of great concern, which you can address in a shelter situation. Has there been any discussion about any of that?
No, those are things that would be put in the MOU, right? As a housing provider, here's how we're setting up the site. Here are our rules. Here's our rules for behavior. Here's how we accept new residents. Here's how we expel residents and in what situation. Then be able to put all that information. That's all part of the MOU.
Great.
And the MOU is, remember, we didn't touch on this in a lot of detail, but when a housing provider comes to the city with an application and a plan, part of that is the MOU as well, right? Because that's a package together. I had that slide earlier where it was like, those things are what are trying to take the place of, in a permanent development a full site plan process. So how do we get as much detail as we can up front? And those things are also critical for when the housing provider is going out to the community in that required public meeting that has to happen. It's purposely set up to happen once an application has been submitted, but before it has been officially reviewed for approval or request of changes, right? Because we want as much of real data for how the site will operate, how it's going to be set up for those conversations with the public.
Okay, I appreciate that. So that makes sense. I do think, without not wanting to add a whole lot to this, but a clarity that it includes some sort of a checklist or some really is helpful, as someone who has to respond to audits and inspections on a regular basis. It is helpful having something like that, I think. And just some thinking about that in advance. So is there absolute clarity as it relates to minor children?
Again, something that would be part of the MOU.
That'd be part of the MOU.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And so really trying to separate how the housing provider is going to propose to run the site and who are the residents that they are going to be able to support, not the city.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, first let me say thank you to you both for presenting this, but also Sherilyn making the distinction that this has nothing to do with HRI. This is an ordinance that we need in our community. The other thing, Mayor, I wanted to say, given that we have the Executive Director of Housing Resources, I'm wondering if she would be willing to come up and clarify some things that have been spoken already.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll get through a couple more questions here that might not be directly related to. So, environmental, which we talk about. If you're doing a development, you would be, any permanent development would be very, very concerned about any environmental liability, which would then, no matter what the site, whether it had been identified as a brownfield site, most sites that have been used in the Kalamazoo probably ultimately, whether identified that or not, do have brownfield components to them. So related to environmental liability for using a site, which with a developer usually do a phase 1, a phase 2, and that sort of thing. Obviously, we are not expecting that, which for this kind of, development makes sense, although a site that we were talking about previously, certainly that was going to, it was an identified brownfield site, and that was one thing that the developer whoever was involved was actually going to really have to be seriously involved in. Just out of our thinking, is there any liability to the city related to, say, waiving an expectation, about assuring that a site, is an environmentally safe site?
So I think I'll let the city attorney jump in on this one, but again, just want to go back to temporary emergency housing with a sunset and thinking, keeping that in our mind for any project that comes through.
Sure. Attorney Leal?
Could you repeat your question again, sir?
So I guess just from temporary or not, I know that there's protections built into the state constitution around people living on sites that may be contaminated, and when you're developing housing, you have to follow all the environmental rules, which is phase 1,
yes.
phase 2,
yes.
BEA,
yes.
all that sort of business, due care, things are identified, that kind of thing. So I'm just saying, if the city, temporary or not, but still a 5-year and 5-year, 6-year living opportunity, if the city does not require that, is that an issue as it relates to any city liability, in that grander scheme of expectations about housing arrangements and environmental issues? And I think
It's possible.
I'm kind of surprising you with that question, I guess, so.
It's possible depending on how, if there is, the worst in people are getting sick from that type of from exposure, it is possible for a lawsuit to be brought against the city, to join the city as one of the defendants in that lawsuit. Of course, it would be the service provider as well as the property owner, which in our case, if it's a BRA, it would be us in two, one defendant but two different roles. And so it is possible. Whether they can succeed or not, that's a different story.
Okay, so that all said, back to just the changes we're talking about, as far as I'm concerned here. I guess the last question I want to ask about that, this idea of phasing. Is there another way to get to this phasing idea by maybe creating a specific set of inspection requirements that, obviously people are going to be, but that could be instituted more quickly, let's say, that might address that issue and still allow for maybe for the development to be, there's already capacity for 50, maybe to get there more quickly, but some of those issues are addressed by some kind of inspection or review or audit or something, after, a month or 2 months, and then that would be a way to facilitate that process.
We are happy to think through options.
Yeah.
The concern with that, again, is the site throughout multiple seasons and years, thinking about how the site is developed, right? In terms of stormwater and drainage and utilities, it's just set up to be different than a permanent site. And so by setting up a shorter timeline that doesn't get through a number of seasons, you might miss that opportunity to understand how a temporary site operates in very inclement weather. And those could be those could be site conditions, things that due to the geography of the property, less so than, the provider who is setting up the site.
Sure.
So there are just trade-offs there, and that's, why staff put forth for that first ramp up, to inspection periods, to 6-month periods, to give us the opportunity to understand how the site will operate with this type of development on it.
All right, I appreciate that. So what is our time frame here in terms of when we're hoping then to have this, extension on our actual agenda to vote on it at a business meeting? And is that a one vote, or does that take 2 meetings?
Sure. It'll be 2 meetings. This is a significant enough change to the ordinance that the city attorney's office has recommended that we do it in 2 steps, which is how it was created.
Yep.
It was how it was created. We need to act by December 1. So we will be working with the city manager's office to understand available agendas. I think we have some work to do to review what we've heard tonight, have some additional conversation with the housing providers, to put forth a revised version for this body to consider. But we need to act, in order for it not to expire, we need to act before December 1.
All right, thanks so much. What is the best, we all have regular communications with the team. Is everybody comfortable with the idea that we've had an opportunity for feedback, there will be some work done, we will see something back again, a draft will come our way, right?
Sure, and we can be guided by what you would like to see. We could come to another committee of the whole meeting and have a discussion. We could come forward at a business meeting. We are happy to bring forward to the setting that is best suited for the discussion and still meet the timeline.
And may I ask for clarity on just a couple things that I think I heard? So I think I heard a couple different suggestions. One, just revise the ordinance as is, which would be exactly what was presented in 2021, just as is, and extend it out to whatever that would be, 2 years, whatever the dates are, 23, 25. Yeah, so one, I heard that, and then I also heard about the phasing, reducing the time of the phasing. And then I also heard something about adding in the checklist for inspections and maybe making some of those MOU requirements a little clearer. Did I hear those things correctly?
People, does that capture? Vice Mayor?
So if you discontinue what it was, it didn't say anything about 20 things.
It didn't. It was 2 years with no phase-in.
So it'd be 2 more years.
Sounds good.
No, that doesn't sound
No
good.
So that one was, okay, so I did hear that one, but am I reading the faces right to say, no, that's not one of the things you want us to bring back?
No, it's not for me. Let me speak for myself. What I would like to see is the original ordinance stay, and we be able to extend it 5 more years at the very least. Because we know and understand that units of housing, it's going to take 2 to 6 years to get those units built. So we need to be able to house people during that time period.
Questions, team?
So we'll take everything we heard and we'll come back with a new draft and we'll work with the city manager for how that comes back to you all. And
Thank you
when.
very much. I appreciate it. All right, thanks for your continued work.
Thank you.
Manager Itzma. I'm sorry. Well, we've got 20 minutes till our next meeting. It's not, yeah, I know. Is this a time, we don't even have an applicant in the door, and we're just going to talk to someone tonight to ask them specific questions about a proposal we haven't even seen?
I think this is a critical issue that we face in the city, and I think it's really important to hear from the people who have come forth with a proposal.
So I'm happy to do that. Are individuals in the room prepared to talk about the proposal? Director Davis?
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Just wanted to respond to a few things I heard. The project that we're working on would be for adults, so there would not be families with children. The project would be collaborative in nature, so there would be strategic partners involved to address the issues, the many issues and complicated issues that people are facing who are living outdoors, from addiction to medical issues to poverty, all of the things that they're struggling with. So we would have partners working with us. We would not be the only supportive service provider on site. The site we are working with is gated, would be controlled access. That is for the protection of the people we are serving, not for the protection of the people outside. It's so that people are safe and secured and cared for, and would allow that only they have access to that site, with controlled access for guests for a certain portion of the site, not full access to the pods. There would be codes of conduct. People can live there as long as they follow those codes of conduct while they're working on a housing plan as a path to permanent housing while it's developed in this community. There would be certain things that they would have to leave the pod community for that are being developed, but overall they can reside there as long as they need to, as long as they're working toward that housing plan. If there's anything else I can answer.
Thank you, Director Davis. Vice Mayor Cooney, does that help?
It helps a lot. And I just hope that, that we listen to that, and that the next proposal that comes before us, we won't have HRI coming up here and saying we can't do the project with that. So I think there has to be some dialogue with them. and come back to us with a proposal which would enable them to make this happen.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Cooney. All right, Manager Ritzma?
That concludes our work session.
Okay,
So,
thank you so much.
Just real quick, looking at the calendar, we do have 2 committee of the whole meetings left. We talked about one being for downtown and parking. We could create the other one for bringing this back, and it could be the next committee of the whole. And then we would have that first reading on that evening, just, based on, obviously, things can be changed based on the cow, just to keep the timing going. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
looks good.
Is that okay, staff, to 2 weeks?
Well, I mean, you gotta be realistic. Does that work for you? If not, let us know.
Yeah, if not, we'll come back to the commission and let you know if it's not going to work.
Okay, thanks, Manager Ritzma. All right, now is the opportunity for commissioner comments. Just a reminder for anybody who's watching, there's also an opportunity for commissioner comments at our business meeting. Any comments for the good of the order? Commissioner Decker.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to say thank you guys for presenting us and bringing options and ideas for the ordinance. I know we tasked you with 2 weeks, and I know you can get it done. I know you heard what everyone said up here, and we are still in a housing crisis. And I know that we're doing everything we can to come out of that. And I think that we just need to make sure that any tools that we have and any barriers that we can remove and not put back into place to make sure that our community knows that we are trying to rectify this issue.
Thank you, Commissioner Decker. Anyone else? All right. Well, we'll see everybody in 15 minutes at our business meeting, and we are adjourned.